What's up, Play Avengers, and anyone else that might have found their way here? I have put together a
Falcon Punch! Falcon Punch! Falcon Punch!
Are you about done with that? I have put together a melee build for Black Widow in Marvel's Avengers. We'll go into some detail. We'll talk about the general stats you're going to want for her. We'll talk about the gear pieces you're going to want to look for her, as well as what perks may or may not help out certain builds, or variations on a build. Before we get started, I want to give a shout out to the great minds behind the Avengers Science Table and all the people that contribute to that. It's a great resource for both new and veteran players alike. It has a lot of detailed information on there, including where to find gear, how the battery effect works, other game mechanics, and it also has links to a lot of great guides and things for characters, including one for Black Widow, which I highly recommend checking out as a supplement to this video. Most of the information on that table and in that guide is still accurate today, though it is a little outdated. A few words about this build. This is a melee build. This is a heroic melee build. This is a high damage, burst damage build. You're going to do a lot of damage with your punching. You're going to be able to one-shot mechs. You're going to be able to one-shot dreadbots. You're going to be able to hit that super adaptoid so hard he's not going to know which way is up from down. This is a technical build. You're going to need to be able to dodge and use your iframes with your heroics as well, due to not having as much health. So we'll go into that later, but there is room for flexibility and adjustability for your playstyle. We'll start with the stats. Before I get into it, I just want to say that this is a general idea of what you're going to want your numbers to look like. Depending on your playstyle, some builds are going to want or need more health, and certainly some proficiency depending on where you have your buffs. As you can see, it's all about valor. That's what your Widow's Bites and your Power Surge scale off of, both might and valor, and that's where the majority of the stats are located. Might, I have 180. You're going to want this on as many pieces as you can get it on. Still prioritizing valor. It's going to let you hit harder with your heroics as well as in regular combat. Precision is a dump stat. Ideally you don't have any of this. Drop it as soon as you can. Proficiency, depending on where you have your buffs, you are going to want some here. If you use the same heroic that I do, 0 is great. It lets you put the numbers elsewhere. Otherwise you're probably going to want 50 to 150. Valor, it scales the best with your heroics. You're going to want this on every single piece if able, and it's going to let you hit the hardest. Health, as I said before, depending on your playstyle, depending on how effective you are at dodging and using the iframes, you might want more. You could also have less, and then you'll be hitting harder than I do, but it's whatever you're comfortable with. Finally, intensity. This is a stat that you could have 0 in because her full auto rounds are so effective at applying status and stunning. If you do that, put them into damage or health. We'll start with the most important thing for any high damage build, and that is the damage buff and how you're going to get it. For Natasha, it's going to be one of 2 spots. It's going to be the heroic slot with 16 hits, or the melee slot with the newer Sonic gear from Wakanda. That gives you a damage buff on critical attacks. Keep in mind, if you decide to go with the melee slot, your stats are limited to might, proficiency, resilience, and I think intensity, or some combination of that, as well as being locked into Sonic, which is a great status. The melee slot is a little easier to activate than the 16 hits, but both are the 2 premier ways to get a damage buff. As you can see, I have elected to go with the heroic slot for my damage buff via the Red Room Cord, which is the legendary version of the last Avengers standing exotic Red Room Coil. The Red Room Cord is a vault mission reward, meaning you're probably going to have to farm quite a few of them in order to get one to drop with the 16 hit damage buff. The first 2 perks are always going to be the same, the Spectre's Terror and the Stealth Blitz. Those up your damage. The Spectre's Terror combos well with the melee critical perk in your melee slot, as well as allowing for 0 proficiency in your build for maximum potential. Other good options, if you decide to go with the damage buff in the melee slot, are another piece utilizing the 16 hits with Might and Valor, You can get a heroic charge burst here, you can get a defense buff here, whatever you want. As well as the storm gear pieces from the Monica's Being the Odds and Tachyon Rift missions. These are powerful pieces. They'll give you Tachyon Surge, which will up your damage output. You're going to want to look for one with a shock potentiator if possible. Next, we'll talk about the defense slot. This slot is used primarily for stats, meaning Might and Valor, or Might and Valor and Proficiency, or Might and Valor and Resolve, depending on your build and needs. The reactive buff for Natasha is not a good proc, at least for the damage buff, as it is for, say, Hulk or Kamala. You could put a reactive buff here, but make it one that you don't want to rely on trying to activate in order to make your build work. Other good options include the Natalia's Cloak, her priority exotic. It comes with a shock potentiator, it comes with a shadow ops amplifier, which both boost your damage. However, it will only come with defensive stats. So if you use this piece, your damage output despite those stats is going to go down. I'd recommend using this one if you need some more health, or if you have a different heroic than I do and are getting your damage buff out of your melee slot and need some health. This is a good one. The final option is the Storm Gear. Once again, you can get Might and Valor on this piece, as well as a Shock Potentiator, and if you can find one of these, it will really boost your damage. The range slot is similar to the defense slot in that it's used primarily for stats per this build. You're going to want to look for full auto rounds that do positive status, meaning PIM, Cosmic, Plasma, or Vibranium. If you want to do the most damage, you're going to want to look for ones that do PIM or Cosmic, as once enemies are fully afflicted with that status, you will do increased damage to them. As you can see, the targeted buff for Natasha is incredibly low. You're going to need to really boost your proficiency and probably use her support heroic if you want a reliable way of ever proccing that buff. I have had some success with weak point attacks granting a buff, but it is about as inconsistent as the targeted buff, if not a little better. That being said, you can hedge here and put a buff that you don't need but don't mind getting, such as the Tachyon Surge or a Jarvis Barrier or an invulnerability buff or something. Just make sure that you don't make it your damage buff. Finally, the melee slot is one of my favorite slots for Widow. It's a very powerful slot, it's a very flexible slot. You have a lot of great options here. There are a lot of perks that boost damage, and you also have access to the melee critical proc, which, unlike her targeted buff in the range slot, you have a really good chance of activating, especially while under the effects of her invisibility. As you can see, I have gone with the PIM's minute unit. It is giving me a PIM payload on melee criticals. It's a really powerful piece. I got fortunate that it also rolled with the Stealth Blitz perk, as well as Might and Valor. It lets me do quick and easy battery damage just by punching enemies. Usually the PIM payload is enough to shrink any enemy and also groups of enemies if they're clustered together, allowing for a quick follow-up from her heavy melee attack, which does shock damage innately, or a Widow's Bite for even more damage. The melee critical slot is very flexible. You have a lot of other gear perks to look for. You can get a Tachyon Surge from the Storm gear that will boost your damage by quite a bit. You can also get Jarvis Barrier if you want more survivability, as well as like heroic charge bursts or things like that. You can also get an invulnerability buff, which if you're able to chain those together, it can make you quite the killing machine. One thing to note for melee builds with Widow's Power Surge is that both the invulnerability buff and the damage buff from the Wakanda piece will proc during her ultimate, while the other melee critical perks will not. And lastly, good tertiary perks to look for in this slot are anything that boosts your heroic charge rate. Obviously the heroic charge burst in the melee critical slot does this as well, or anything that boosts damage, such as the Stealth Breaker or the Shadow Ops modifier, with the Stealth Breaker being the more powerful of the two, though they are pretty close in damage output. The 135% increased critical attack damage works out very well in regular combat with your regular punches, but it does not scale or work with her heroics, meaning her power surge or her widow's bites, so I tend to avoid that perk. Finally, you can of course go for a shock potentiator in this slot from Hive Mind gear. Finally, we'll touch on the major and minor artifacts. As you see here, I have a couple triple valor ISOs equipped. You're going to want to look for these. These are going to let you hit the hardest with your widow's bites and your power surge. You're going to want to prioritize ones with good perks. As you can see, I have a couple that increase my heroic charge rate for both my support and assault abilities. For the major artifact, I primarily use the tachyon. It lets me do status faster, it lets me do more status damage, gives me a little bump in valor and might. That being said, I also do use the Sacred Nornstone of Lethal Will. This is with the double damage buff. It's going to let you spike the bosses the hardest, the Super Adaptoid, and both of these are viable options for this build. Some final thoughts on the build / gear pieces before we go into Black Widow's skills. I would highly recommend getting your damage buff from the heroic slot via 16 hits, whether it's using the Red Room Cord like I am, or another of your choosing with Might and Valor on it. While you're getting that damage buff, you're also applying positive status on the enemies with your full auto positive rounds, preferably Cosmic or PIM as I said before, but if you do prefer Plasma or Vibranium, that's fine. It's the easiest and quickest and most efficient way to set up that battery effect that you're going to see some big damage on when you get in close and use Natasha's Widow's Bites, her Power Surge, or her heavy attacks. With that being said, if you do decide to go with the damage buff in the melee slot, you're going to want to find a way to do that positive status, which is still most likely going to be those full auto positive rounds, but you also might need to utilize her plasma grenades or find some other gear pieces that are going to do that for you. I'm going to briefly talk about Natasha's moveset here. She's got a lot of great moves. She flows in combat really well. Her signature attack is great for applying status. Positive, if you can find it, works out really well with her heavy attacks and nightsticks, which do exploit shock damage, meaning that while they don't status the enemy, they exploit positive status if you've already shot the enemy with your PIM rounds or use the grenades with plasma on them to apply that positive status. This is a great move to use when you're not using your heroics. It's a good one to get in the rhythm of dodging into and out of it in order to apply that battery effect. I'm going to pick the skill trees here as brief as I can. I just want to point out that a lot of these skills are bugged to either our benefit or dismay. The Avengers Science Table and that Black Widow guide that I've mentioned before point out a lot of these. Some of them have changed in that they've been fixed, and others have not. So I'll go over them quickly and I'll try to point that out as we go. For Natasha's support heroic ability, you can choose to increase the damage done when you activate Veil of Shadows. You can choose to extend the invisibility as well as boost your crit chance, or you can choose to have increased heroic energy by making more orbs. The damage boost isn't that significant. The clear winner here is the Night Terror, which actually extends your invisibility by 7 seconds, not 3, as well as giving you that critical attack chance. However, if you're struggling to get your heroics back in a timely fashion, you can pick the third one. The right side here is a little bit of a wash. The Mortal Cloak would be a clear winner, but it's been broken since the beginning of the game. I, however, haven't tested this. They have fixed some of these. You have to check with your teammates via a lot of testing to see if this one is fixed. Next we have Widow's Assault Heroic. It's the reason you're here. It's the reason to play this melee build in the first place, and that is to turn this puny looking dart thing into
Falcon Punch!
The Lightning Fist does a ton of damage. It does a ton of shock damage. You can battery with it. You can hold 4 charges of it. It's going to let you spike bosses really hard. It's going to let you use it to give you iframes. It's going to let you punch those annoying stiletto bots that are spinning all over the place. On the right side here, you can choose to increase the stun damage that it does. You can choose to recover some heroic energy, or you can choose to hold an additional bite. You don't need to stun the enemies. You're killing them. The energy looks nice on paper, but what's going to let you spike the most, what's going to let you do the most damage, what's going to give you the most iframes is to pick this additional charge. For Widow's ultimate heroic, on the left side here, you have a couple options. If you want to maximize your damage potential, you're going to want to pick the Galvanic Bite. It's going to let your Widow's bites do more damage. This skill used to be bugged, but it has been fixed as of patch I don't know when. You can also pick the Power Staff option, which will let you do more damage with your staff. Keep in mind this is only while you are in your overcharge state, whereas the Galvanic Bite just requires you to be in your ultimate. On the right side, there is an auto pick in the Power Grid skill. It actually increases your ultimate by 15 seconds, not 4. This is the one that you're going to want to go with. For Natasha's mastery skills, in the intrinsic ability, you're going to want to go with the overcharge damage on the left side here. The damage increase is actually 12.5%, not 5, and it's going to scale with your heroics, the Widow's Bites, and the Power Surge, unlike the overcharge critical, which for some reason does not. In the middle here, you're probably going to want to go with the intrinsic charge. It's pretty applicable in all scenarios. It lets you get that intrinsic shadow ops buff more easily. And you're going to want to have that online as often as possible. On the right side, you have a couple options here. I've gone with the efficient overcharge. Again, I've spoken about how good the shadow ops buff is. You're going to want to keep that active as long as you can or as often as possible. And keeping that increased delay allows for that. However, if you're struggling to get your heroics back, you can pick the heroic overcharge in order to get more energy so you can punch more often. The range tree here is all about Widow's grenades and how you use her guns. For the grenades, they scale off of precision damage, so you're not going to be doing a lot of damage with them per this melee build, but you are going to apply status. For that reason, you're going to want the lingering status with the hazard grenades, and then as well as figuring out how you're going to want to get your battery effect, meaning you're probably going to want to go with plasma, the other two options being cryo and shock. These grenades are decent, and they're a decent way to apply status. However, I found they kind of leave you exposed. They're a little slow and they only affect the area kind of right in front of her. I tend to prefer statusing the enemies with the full auto rounds. On the right side here, the extended magazines is the clear winner. If you haven't learned or if you don't know already, you can reload your pistols by just hitting back and forth on your D-pad, and you can do it during a takedown, you can do it during a heroic, you can do it while you're jumping, you can do it when you're getting chokeslammed by an adaptoid. This is a good skill to have and something you should be doing, so you do not need that reload, whereas the extended magazines allow you to apply that status more easily as you can shoot for longer. Next, for Widow's invisibility tree here on the left side, you can choose to do more stun damage, range damage, or status damage while invisible. The status damage means you fill up the status bar quickly, not do more status damage, unfortunately. So the perk is kind of meh, but stun damage is the same, and range damage does not apply to our build, so we choose to go with applying that status quicker and achieving that battery effect faster. In the middle here, once upon a time, choosing to extend your invisibility would have been a great option. However, now that CD has changed combat so that your active buffs aren't depleted while performing a takedown or heroic, or most heroics anyways, that makes this perk less valuable. So we go with the invisible recharge here to get your heroics back faster so you can punch more often. On the right side here, there's a couple options. If you have the same heroic I do with the Spectre's Terror perk allowing you to achieve those automatic criticals from behind, I would pick the critical attack damage. Again, this doesn't scale with her heroics, but you will see this damage boost in regular combat with her heavy attacks and the battery damage. If you're not doing that, I do recommend the critical melee perk, which gives you a pretty high critical attack chance from melee attacks, which is going to work just great with those melee critical perks. It's going to let you get those buffs more easily. For a lot of builds, you are going to want to pick that skill instead. Finally, the utility mastery tree. It's not that exciting for Widow in what it brings to the table, save for the right side. On the left one, you're going to pick the heroic energy orb as you do for all Avengers in this game, save for perhaps Black Panther. In the middle, you have the option to do more stun, you have the option to do more headshot damage, or you have the option to do more range damage. They're all kind of whatever for our melee build, so I went with the flat increase to range damage. On the right side, the last perk lets you generate more intrinsic from light and heavy attacks. That's a great one, and one that you are probably in almost all cases going to want to pick. However, you will see some damage based out of the light and heavy combat finishes, especially with Widow's Nightstick attacks. So you could pick that one if you want to see those numbers boosted a bit. Last but not least, we have the champion skills. As you can see, I put my first 155 points into the 5 trees that matter the most. Champion 155 is the new champion 375. These trees are the most impactful. They give you the largest boost, and you're going to see not that much of a difference between a champion 155 that's put all their points into these trees and one that's 375. For Black Widow, I would recommend doing the critical damage first, putting your first 31 points there. You're going to see that damage on your heroics. You're going to see it on your Widow's Bites and your Power Surge. After that, I recommend either doing heroic charge rate or critical chance, perhaps bouncing back and forth between the two, and finally ending with perk chance and armor. Perk chance is going to give your boost to melee criticals and reactive buffs if you're doing that, whereas armor is going to give you a little bit of boost to your survivability, even with our low health in this build. And that about wraps it up. Hopefully it wasn't too long-winded, hopefully it wasn't too overly complicated. Again, another great resource to check out is that Avengers Science table, as well as that Black Widow guide that can be found on there. I highly recommend that. Before I go, I will leave you with the build in action against my man, Maestro.
This should be fun! Get ready! This will hurt! Just be done!
We got the sample. Let's get back to the past. I think we've seen more than enough today.